favorite subjects to talk about of all time, ancient Egypt, the Exodus, greatest salvation event in the Old Testament, the event that gave us the reality and the imagery of the Passover lamb and the great deliverance of God and the prophet Moses. And of course, we know the great warrior Yeshua who brought Israel into the promised land, all foreshadowing Jesus, all foreshadowing the Lord. So the question that many people wonder about is whether or not it actually happened as it stated in the Scripture. And this is, I'll tell you, one of the most controversial, not controversial to us, but among Old Testament scholars and among biblical scholars, creates the most debate. And there are so many things that flow from the denial of the Exodus. Just like, I would say, archaeologically and historically, the Exodus is sort of like God's existence when it comes to connecting all the things in the Old Testament. So earlier we were talking about God's existence. If God doesn't exist, then this is not true, and that's not true. God's existence, there's so many things that hinge on God's existence. Well, just like that is true, there are so many things that hinge on the reality of the Exodus and conquest. Did it really happen, or is it just a story that was made up? Let me tell you the general view that most scholars have, and I hate to burst your bubble here. You could probably doesn't surprise you, but the general consensus among most, not all, but I would say the large majority of ancient Near Eastern scholars, archaeologists, biblical scholars, is that the Exodus did not happen as it is described in the Bible. In fact, not only did it not happen, one of the most popular archaeologists, Egyptologists, Don Redford, and not just him, but many others, believe that the Exodus, the story of the Exodus, was very likely made up and sort of invented during the Babylonian exile. Now, they do believe in the Babylonian exile because there's a lot of historical evidence for that. It's hard to deny that. The Israelites went into Babylonian captivity, and that is where they formed their national identity. And they began to create these stories to give them a national identity. We have a word in the South for that, hogwash. No. As God said, I brought my son Israel out of Egypt. That is where Israel came from. Did they come from Babylonian exile and make the Exodus up? The other story of the origin of Israel, of course, is we know biblically that Israel ultimately came from Abraham, Father Abraham. He called Abraham from Ur of the Chaldees, and he said, get out of this, go to a land we're going to show you. And Abraham followed God, went up to Haran, up into Turkey, and then eventually went down into Canaan. And, of course, that's where he offered Isaac, and the rest is history. He had, Jacob, and then Jacob's sons end up in Egypt. So the question is, did this actually happen? The question about the Exodus surfaces something very important in Old Testament scholarship. And it is an area of vociferous debate, even among evangelical conservative archaeologists. And that issue is chronology. Chronology is the dating. When did it happen? And people debate, say, well, it happened this year, it happened that year. Here's the Fair of the Exodus. No, this is the Fair of the Exodus. And everybody's got an opinion about the Fair of the Exodus. But at the end of the day, according to logic, can they all be true? No, only one can be true. And what is truth? Truth is that which corresponds to reality. But archaeology, I will say, just to remind you, archaeology is based on cumulative evidence. There's not any one specific piece of evidence. There is a cumulative case. And when you begin to unpack the biblical data on the Exodus, I believe it will lead you inevitably to look at certain time frames and certain pharaohs and certain things of pieces of evidence that indicate when the Exodus very likely occurred. And I say likely, and I'm now leaning on very strongly likely occurred, that the Exodus happened in the date that we think. So these are the pharaohs of the 18th dynasty of Pharaoh. This is when Egypt was at the height of his power. You may or may not be aware of Egyptian history. Some of us, so we have some of the students that are taking our course right now in ancient Egyptian history and ancient Egypt in the Old Testament. But this is actually when Egypt was at the height of its power. Egypt underwent different phases in its history. In Egyptian history, you have pre-dynastic Egypt, which is when before what we would call pharaohs, before there were pyramids. You have pre-dynastic Egypt, and Dynasty 0, the very first, or what they call Dynasty 0. And there's some debate even among who was the first unifier of Egypt. Was it a pharaoh, or was it a king by the name of Narmer or Menes, or another king that some people have said is a king who goes by the name of the Scorpion King? Sounds like a wrestler, but no. This is actually before hieroglyphics, really early in history. So you have the pre-dynastic Egypt, then you have the Old Kingdom, the Middle Kingdom, and the New Kingdom, okay? In between the kingdoms, you have, and in the Old Kingdom, you'll have dynasties. There'll be Dynasty 1, 2, 3, and 4, and 5. So in the 18th dynasty, this falls in the Middle Kingdom of Egyptian history. In between the kingdoms, you have something that Egyptian historians, Egyptologists called intermediate periods. Why do they call it an intermediate period? Great question. An intermediate period that goes in between the kingdoms is a time of instability in Egyptian history. There is a foreign ruler who's reigning over the throne of Egypt, or maybe Egypt is split. Egypt was a land of dichotomies. You have the north and the south. You have the northern kingdom. Actually, the north is called Lower Egypt, and the south is called Upper Egypt. And the reason why that is because the Nile flows from the south to the north. I know it's confusing. So in any case, these pharaohs in the 18th dynasty, these are some of the most powerful pharaohs in Egyptian history. This is when Egypt was at the height of its power politically, militarily, and architecturally. The only other pharaoh that can somehow compete with the 18th dynasty is Ramses II, also known as Ramses the Great. He's in the 19th dynasty. Okay? So, what is the deal here about the 18th dynasty? Why do we think the Exodus occurred in the 18th dynasty? Well, because of a passage there, I call it internal evidence in the Scripture itself. As we stated in the earlier slide, the Bible gives us evidence as to when things happen. And one of the key pieces of evidence for this date is 1 Kings chapter 6, verse 1. 1 Kings chapter 6, verse 1. Essentially, it says, I'm going to paraphrase it, but the essence of the passage is that King Solomon laid the foundations of the temple in Jerusalem 480 years after the Exodus. So we know that date. In fact, that date, the date of King Solomon laying the temple foundation, is a date that hardly anyone argues over. That date's not up for debate. And that date is around 966 or 967 BC. So the question that's debated is whether or not the 480 years is to be considered literal or figurative. It's 1 Kings. It's not 1 Psalms. It's not 1 Song of Solomon. It's narrative. It's straight narrative, which means that from a hermeneutical standpoint, we should take that as a literal year. Exactly. I mean, it means what it says. It's not even like speaking in metaphorical language. It's just saying in 480 years after the Exodus, Solomon laid down foundation of the temple. And so when you reverse the clock back, that puts you at about the year 1446 BC. And that is when the date, that's when we, again, even if you didn't agree with that thinking, just for the sake of argument, at least look at the evidence. Go back 480 years and see who the pharaohs were. This lands us into the 18th dynasty, somewhere around the reign of Thutmose III or Amenhotep II. Now, there's so many rabbit trails, and this is what's going to be difficult for me to keep myself on the track here. But let me just say, among Egyptologists, among people who study ancient Egypt, and some of us who are taking our class right now, we've been talking about this. Even among Egyptologists, there is debate about when you start drilling into the exact dates, there's some squabble and debates about the chronology of Egyptian dynasties. And so all Egyptologists agree on the general Old Kingdom, New Kingdom, intermediate periods. They all agree on those dates. But when you get into the individual dates of like Amenhotep I or Tutmosis I or Hatshepsut or whatever, there's debate about that. And the debate centers around whether or not one should adopt something called the high chronology or the low chronology. High chronology, low chronology. Now, I know you don't need to know this stuff, but I want to give you the reasoning why. I want you to give the background reason why I hold to this. So, for the sake of time and for argument's sake, I'm just going to go ahead and tell you, I hold to the high chronology. The high chronology. Why do I hold to the high chronology? Well, do y'all want to know all this stuff? Is this interesting to you? Okay, so the reason why I hold to the high chronology is because of the thing when you get into these dates, like they have some approximate dates as to when these kings reigned, okay? And when the problem in archaeology it is a problem, and this is where the point of debate is. Whenever you find an artifact like this piece of pottery here from Lachish, or mentioned Lachish, this is from Lachish, by the way. We mentioned that earlier. I noticed. You see anybody see a date on that anywhere? Was that made in 1446 BC? There's no date on it. There's no dates. What's that? Yeah, you can see it, exactly. But when you go to Egypt and you study these pyramids and these tombs and these inscriptions, it has all kinds of hieroglyphics, but there's no date on it. So where can we as historians, is there anywhere we can go to get some kind of date that we can anchor it to? Actually, there is. And it depends on exactly which historical period you're talking about. But this is called astronomical dating, because sometimes in the historical record, people will record astronomical events. And we know from many Egyptian texts, many Egyptian monuments, that the Egyptians recorded the rising of the Sothic star. Why was that important to the Egyptians? It was important because it was when the star rose up, it indicated the annual flooding of the Nile. And the reason why that was important is because this would indicate if they were going to have a good year of crops or a bad year of crops. So the entire Egyptian religion and priesthood centered around the rising of the Sothic star. Well, as it turns out, there is a papyrus that records the rising of the Sothic star that appeared on the birth date of Thutmose I. So that will give us the accurate date. And so the debate about this papyrus, when it came up, that records the rising of the Sothic star, which commemorated the beginning reign of Thutmose I, was it recorded in Thebes or was it recorded in Memphis? Thebes is in the southern part of Egypt. Memphis is in the northern part of Egypt. And so the reason why that's important is because that will affect the dates of these pharaohs by 20 to 30 years. There's a 20 to 30, so it's not a long period of time. But there was a Greek writer by the name of Olympodorus, a manuscript that came out years ago, and it's been published, and Olympodorus tells us where the priest recorded the rising of the Sothic star, and it was in Memphis, which then gives us the anchor point for the birth date or the beginning regnal date of Thutmose I. So now that we have that date is pretty settled, now we know the relative dates of how long they reign, but if we can attach an exact date, and we can do and by the way, how do we know that date? That's a good question. Here's why, and I'll give you the quick answer, so there was a German astronomer by the name of Johannes Kepler, and Kepler was able to essentially really refine the orbits of the planets, and he basically made these the planets actually travel in ellipses, not in complete circles, not in a perfect circle, because Newton and many of the other astronomers and physicists believe that it was in this perfect spheres, and so when you make these adjustments, these Kepler adjustments, then you're able to, basically like the universe is like a giant clock. And you can actually buy you can probably get free, there's probably free software online. I know there's one, I had it years ago. There's several programs that are out there. The one that I had is called Redshift, and you can put it on your laptop, and you can literally punch in a date. You can put in, okay, I want to be in Babylon in the year 1436 BC, and I want to look at what the sky looked like in 1436 BC. You can do that. Why? Because of astronomy, because of these software programs, because the sky and the computer just does the math, and it shows you what the sky looks like, and it is solid. It's all based in math and in the universe, just like the Bible says. So when you do the math, then this all gives us some pretty firm dates of the beginning reign of Thutmose I. And now we know that this then places, if you begin to work out the chronology of Israel being in Egypt, this works out the chronology of Moses being born sometime around the time when this queen named Hatshepsut, she was actually a princess, she was a young girl, probably a teenage girl, when her father was Thutmose I. And it gets a little bit, and I hate to use this in this wonderful term, this wonderful conference we're in, but Jerry Springer, it gets a little Jerry Springer-ish, because here's why. I'll tell you why. Because Thutmose I was the father, okay, and in Egypt, and not just in Egypt, but also in Mesopotamia as well, you wanted your firstborn son to succeed you. If your first wife, or if your primary wife could not provide male offspring, you could actually have a concubine, get with a concubine, and have a son. So, but it's still not your firstborn. Technically, they sort of looped around it, but technically it wasn't his firstborn. His firstborn was a daughter. So Thutmose I, firstborn was a daughter. So he gets with a concubine, and he has his son, Thutmose II. You know who his daughter was? Hatshepsut. So Hatshepsut marries Thutmose II. She marries her half-brother. Yeah, it's kind of weird. And Thutmose II ends up dying through mysterious circumstances. Some people, there's theorized whether he was poisoned or whether there was court intrigue. Maybe it was natural causes, but whatever the case was, Thutmose II, who was married to his half-sister, Hatshepsut, dies at a pretty early age, and so they get together, and they have first a daughter, and then he wants to have a son, so his son is Amenhotep II. Okay, so Thutmose III and Hatshepsut co-reign for about 18 to 20 years. So he's a baby when his father dies. And according to not just myself, but this is some pretty, again, there's no way, can I prove this with 100% certainty? No. But Dr. Eugene Merrill talks about this in his book, Kingdom of Priests, and many other Old Testament scholars that I really trust talk about this. The timing is just right. And there's only one person that we know of in Egyptian history that would have done this, and it was Hatshepsut when she was a teenage girl, likely during the reign of her father, Thutmose I, who instituted basically the command to kill the Hebrew firstborn. She probably would have taken Moses as a young boy and raised him in the household of the Pharaoh. So very likely, Moses possibly knew Thutmose III. Thutmose III was considered to be the Napoleon of Egypt. He did 17 campaigns into the Levant. He was at the height. He did apart from Ramses II, the greatest builder of Egypt. Egypt was at the height of its power. So interestingly, this is when we have the most inscriptional evidence. Here's the Jerry Springer slide that I like to say. This is all the primary wife, secondary wife. Thutmose and Hatshepsut have Nephure, and then who is their only daughter. And then he gets with Isit, his secondary wife, and they have Thutmose III, and then he dies, and then Thutmose and Hatshepsut co-reign for 22 years. And so then, and by the way, Thutmose III was very likely, here's the thing, and I'm jumping ahead here a lot. One of the other pharaohs, candidates for the pharaoh, Exodus pharaoh, is Ramses II. And I'll get into him in a minute, but I'll tell you here at this point why I don't believe it was Ramses II. For a lot of reasons, but this is one of the reasons. Does anybody know anything about Ramses II? How much do you know about Ramses II? He was a great king. But did you know that he was one of the longest reigning kings of Egypt? He reigned for 66 to 67 years. Can you imagine having a president for, oh, please, Lord, not. But he reigned for a long time. Now, what does the Bible tell us about Moses? Something very curious. Moses kills an Egyptian and goes into where? For 40 years. Midian, for 40 years. And so, if Moses goes to Midian and Tutmos III, and Ramses II is on the throne, well, he's reigning for quite a long time. Then maybe Moses comes back after Ramses dies, but the math just doesn't work out. But if it's Tutmos III, then it would make sense why Moses would flee. Why would Moses flee if he's raised in the Egyptian household, unless Tutmos III considered Moses to be a possible usurper for his throne, a possible contender for the throne of Egypt. That was always a threat. And so it makes very much sense why Moses would have fled to Midian under the reign of Tutmos III. And so when he's there in Midian for 40 years is when God speaks to him at the burning bush. And what I find interesting about this is when God speaks to Moses, where is Moses when God speaks to him at the burning bush? Is he in Egypt? Is he in the Sinai? Or is he in Midian? He's in Midian. And what does God say? He has this interesting conversation in Exodus chapter 3. And he says, when I go back to Egypt and I ask them, what is your name? What do I tell them? And that's very interesting. When I ask them, what is your name? Oh, I was like, that always struck me as kind of odd. Why would he even have to ask them that question? Like, why would they not know his name? Well, maybe they had forgotten his name. Maybe they had forgotten. The answer is even more astounding. We often, in the Old Testament, we often focus on one aspect of the divine name when it's a powerful aspect, but we forget the second aspect, and especially in a congregation like this, it's very important. The first aspect of the name in Exodus 3, I am who I am, or literally in the Hebrew is, I will be what I will be. I am. Okay, I am is a good translation. But then we skip over the second part. I am the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. This is my name, the name by which I shall be remembered from generation to generation. So God is connecting his eternal name and nature to the covenants that he made with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. So as long as God exists, he will keep his word to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Very powerful imagery there. So, and then he says something to Moses. He says, you will come back, and this will be a sign, Moses, that I'm with you. You're going to come back and worship me on this mountain, the same mountain that he received the Ten Commandments. That's Mount Horeb, Mount Sinai. And that is where Moses flees to Midian, and then he goes back to Egypt, and he confronts the Pharaoh there in Egypt. Now, what do we know about Hatshepsut? We know that she built one of the most amazing mortuary temples at a place called Deir el-Bahari in the Valley of the Kings, next to the Pharaoh after the first intermediate period to the left there. It's kind of hard to see. It's just on the left side, very hard to see. It's called the mortuary temple of Mentuhotep, who was the Pharaoh after the first intermediate period. And so she built even a grander monument to Mentuhotep. And it's right there. So hers is on the right. Mentuhotep is on the left. So here's something very curious about Hatshepsut as well. We know, and this is not even controversial, that sometime after the reign of either Tutmos III or Amenhotep II, somebody went around and erased all of her names, her cartouches, off of Egyptian monuments. It was like they were trying to get rid of her, because what did she do? The only thing she did was help raise her stepson and make him a great, powerful king. But she also helped the Hebrew slaves. And she helped this Hebrew named Moses grow up, and he brought all this calamity on Egypt. So there's a lot of debate about who was it that defaced Hatshepsut's monuments. And not only Hatshepsut, but also some other things found at the city where we think the Israelites were located, at a city called Avaris, which is in the Nile Delta. But this is an amazing, amazing mortuary temple. They were not able to erase everything because some things remain. This is actually at the Luxor, one of the pylons at Luxor. This is Thutmose III and Hatshepsut. He's on the left as a teenage boy. She's on the right, presenting herself as a male pharaoh. And again, the name is in the cartouche. The cartouche is from the French word cartridge. And when Napoleon and his men were reinforcing a French fort there in Rashid, Egypt, which also goes by the name of Rosetta. They found the Rosetta Stone, and they found, of course, it was a three-part inscription, three texts. Actually, the same message, but in three different texts. You had the bottom, you had Greek, in the middle, you had Demotic, and in the top, you had hieroglyphics. And what they discovered, they knew Greek, but they didn't know Demotic, and they didn't know hieroglyphics. But they were able to figure out that there were these long cylindrical-looking circle things that looked like cartridges that when you would put a cartridge in a black powder gun back in Napoleon's guns, so they called it our cartouche. And there is the cartouche of Hatshepsut. There, you see it on above her head, the cartouche, and the cartouche of Thutmose. And by the way, this is confusing. In Egypt, pharaohs had 5 different names. 5 different names. Can you imagine that? Like, okay, we're going to have a son. Let's come up with 5 names, you know. But the names had to do with, first there was his birth name, then there was his pronomen, and then there was his Horus name, his golden Horus name, and all these other names, these epithets that you would give for the names of the pharaoh. And that's going to become very important here in a moment. We're going to talk about that. This is actually Thutmose III on his 7th pylon at Karnak in Luxor, conquering and subduing all of the enemies to the north and Syria. A couple of years ago when I was in Istanbul, I love Istanbul. It's actually a fascinating city, a lot of historical stuff there. And I knew that there was an obelisk in the old hippodrome, the old city of Constantinople. And I'd been there quite a few times, but I finally walked over and read, and I did not know, this is actually an obelisk from Thutmose III. And it was brought there. I found out it was actually brought to Constantinople this slide is incorrect. I need to correct this slide. It was brought to Constantinople by Constantine the Great, but it was erected by Theodosius. So Constantine brought it, but it wasn't actually erected until the reign of Theodosius, which incidentally, by the way, this is so, I love irony, and talk about irony. It was Theodosius in the year 390 that had hieroglyphics, reading of hieroglyphics outlawed all throughout Egypt, because Egypt was part of the Byzantine Empire. Isn't that interesting? The last known hieroglyphic inscription was at the temple at Philae on an island in the Nile across from Thebes. I think it was near Thebes. And so he outlawed the reading of hieroglyphics, and it was lost until the time of Napoleon, and when his troops found the Rosetta Stone, and then the Rosetta Stone was translated by Jean-Francois Champollion in 1823. But this is actually the obelisk of Thutmose III, and that's actually there at the base of the hippodrome. And right below that little guardrail there is the bottom where the hippodrome was. It's like 10 feet below ground now. And this is actually marble. This thing has not moved since the year 390 A.D. This thing's been there for a long time. And this actually shows you a picture of Theodosius with all of his royal entourage. The question is, did he know Moses? Is there a way to prove this with 100% certainty? No. There's no way to know with 100% certainty, but we can infer that he likely either knew Moses or certainly knew of him. And I tend to think that he probably knew Moses. If he was, of course, in a royal household, you're going to have all kinds of servants. He probably knew about this Hebrew, this Asiatic. They wouldn't have been probably known as a Hebrew. They would have been known as an Asiatic, they called him, or maybe even a not a Hyksos. The Hyksos literally means foreign rulers. It's actually a mistranslation. Hyksos doesn't mean shepherd kings. It means foreign rulers. But it was an Apiru, the Apiru. It's a cognate of Hebrew. So this Apiru from the land of retinue. The Egyptians called what we call Israel today the land of retinue. That's where they called it. They didn't call it Syria. They called it the land of retinue. And so the question is, did he know Moses? He was the Napoleon of Egypt. No. Now, it turns out we actually have, when I say we, I don't mean me personally, but Egyptologists, archaeologists, we have found his mummy. So how would you like to see the mummy of the man who possibly knew Moses and grew up with him? Is anybody grossed out about mummies? You want to see it? It's kind of gross, but here we go. There he is. Yeah. He looks kind of bad. What's that? Mummy dearest. Yeah, mummy dearest. We also, as it turns out, have the mummy of Hatshepsut. And her mummy is actually in much better state of preservation, and she looks like she is quite at peace. And this is an amazing episode in the Exodus account. The Bible tells us that Moses' mother, and by the way, a trivia question, what was Moses' mother's name? Jochebed. What'd you say it in Hebrew? Jochebed. Jochebed, as we say. Jochebed. She did something quite remarkable. She makes an ark out of the bulrushes, and she pitches it. She literally remakes a little ark, and she remembers that God. And here's a lot of cool stuff going on here. In the Genesis account of the flood, the Genesis account, as it turns out, is in a chiastic type structure. It's called a polystrophe. And in Hebrew, of course, you can't read it. In English, it doesn't look like this. But in the Hebrew, there's this A, B, sub B structure. And all of the text of the flood account points to Genesis chapter 8, verse 1, which, interesting, you know what that verse says? And God remembered Noah. And God remembered Noah. God didn't forget. Did God forget Abraham? Did God forget that he made a promise to Abraham? No. And so, isn't it amazing? A mother's faith. A mother remembers that God remembered Noah. And this woman's faith, she places her baby in an ark. The only time the ark is mentioned is in the flood account, and here in this account when Moses' mother puts him in the basket of reeds. That's awesome. And I think it's a statement of her faith. And we should praise this woman of great faith because she was saying, in essence, God, you remembered Noah. Now remember your people. We're here. We're not gone anymore. And maybe she prayed for him, and there she is, and she releases him on the Nile, and then he is found by Hatshepsut, who was, as it turns out. And the other thing that's cool about Hatshepsut is that she was a great mentor. She mentored one of the most successful pharaohs in Egyptian history, Thutmose III. He was the greatest pharaoh of Egyptian history. Incredible building projects. Apart from Ramses, again, the two greatest. You could ask any Egyptologist. This is not a Christian thing. You could just ask any. Who do you say would be the two or three greatest pharaohs in Egyptian history? I'll tell you who they would be. Seti I, Thutmose III, and Ramses II. Seti was Ramses' father. Thutmose III was raised by his stepmother, Hatshepsut, and she raised him and she taught him, this is how you rule. This is how you rule a kingdom. Who else is in there? What does the Bible say in Acts chapter 7? Moses was trained in all the learning of the Egyptians. Was he raised, perhaps, and mentored by Hatshepsut and her royal court? How to read hieroglyphics, how to build a canal, how to organize people. It's certainly very possible, and I think very likely. Now, how many of you like to see Hatshepsut? Here we go. Here she is. And she almost has kind of a smile, doesn't she? There's kind of a resting smile on her face. And I had one of my students, when I show this, I would say, well, Professor Wright, how do we know that's Hatshepsut? Well, because her name was on the coffin. And in one of the dynasties back in, I think it was in the later dynasty, in the late 19th, early 20th dynasties, the grave robbing was becoming so great that the priest took many of the sarcophagi out of the tombs, and they placed them in a shaft near the mortuary temple at Deir el-Bahari, near the tomb of Mentuhotep, known as, I think it's called TT 320 is the technical name for it, which is a shaft tomb in the Valley of the Kings. This was a cache of all the mummies of the I would say all, most of the mummies of the 18th dynasty, including Amenhotep II, Hatshepsut, Thutmose III, and many, many others. And they were put there so they would not be raided. Later, in the 19th century, in the 1800s, there were some Egyptian grave robbers that were going, they had found it secretly, and they were keeping it a secret, and they were secretly going in there at night, and they were like getting some stuff, and they were selling on the black market, and they were like, hey, I found this Egyptian scarab or this gold necklace. And so somebody finally said, hey, where are you getting this stuff? Oh, we got this place we found. It's really cool. And the guy who eventually got wind of this was a French guy by the name of Gaston Maspero. And Gaston Maspero actually traced down the location of this shaft. They arrested the guys for grave robbing, and they excavated these things out. And at that time, Egypt had this big ceremony, and this was the basis of the museum at Cairo, the Egyptian museum at Cairo, which is they just built a new one. So this is known as the royal cache, and Hatshepsut was actually in the royal cache, and all of the mummies were brought out, and so really quite remarkable. But this is an image that has been chiseled away sometime during the reign, either the late reign of Thutmose II, and the other theory that was actually during the later reign of Amenhotep II, and that's actually the view that I hold to, is that it's more likely that the Pharaoh of the Exodus, the Pharaoh that Moses would have confronted with Aaron and the plagues, would have had motivation to actually erase all of her monuments, because she was the one to bring this Hebrew in to begin with. And so he would have motivation to erase all of her images off of the temple walls. But there's other things about his reign, too, that lend credibility to the Exodus account, which we'll unpack here in just a moment. But early on in his reign, he presents himself as a very able, he's astute at riding a chariot at full gallop, shooting archery with a bow and arrow. And so he is following in the footsteps of his father, Thutmose III. Now, this is the time frame now. Thutmose III is dead. Moses is in Midian. And so by the time Moses comes back from Midian, he's now coming back to the court of Amenhotep II. Now, there's a lot. We don't have time, but I will give you as much as I can on this. Why would we think, besides the fact of 2 Kings chapter 2, or 6, verse 1, and these other things, why else would we think that it's these pharaohs of the 18th dynasty that would actually be the pharaohs of the Exodus? Here's why, and this is, to me, one of the most powerful reasons for Amenhotep II. And this takes a little, you wouldn't know this unless you really are digging into Egyptian history. And that is, mostly through Egyptian history, through all the dynasties, in the Old Kingdom, in the New Kingdom, the Middle Kingdom rather, even in the 18th dynasty, the only pharaoh in the 18th dynasty who moved his capital back to the old capital at Memphis was Amenhotep II. The rest of the pharaohs of the 18th dynasty, and even with Ramses II, their capital was in Thebes, way hundreds of miles to the south. So why is that important? Because where were the Israelites? They were in Goshen. Where is Goshen? It's in the Nile Delta. It's in the north. It's in the north in that marshy area up there in the eastern part of the Nile Delta. Where is Memphis? Well, it's just a hop, skip, and a jump down the river to go. And what is Moses and Aaron doing? They're going and seeking audience with the Pharaoh. But not only that, Amenhotep II, there is a royal palace, a barge palace, guess where? At Avaris, which is where the Israelites would have been located. So they have an immediate audience with Amenhotep II there at Deir el-Bahari, which is where we think the Israelites were located. So I really think all the evidence, all the arrows, it's not just one, but it's all the cumulative case, points to Amenhotep II as being the Exodus Pharaoh. Now, here is Avaris, and this is another indication of the Israelites actually being in Egypt, not only of the dating of the Pharaoh, but also of the location of where they would have been located, or where they were actually settled in this area of Egypt. Now, this is not the only place the Israelites would have been. They lived in other places, but primarily this was the main hub of where the Jews lived. Before this period in Egyptian history, a couple of hundred years before that, there were a group of Hyksos that actually occupied Avaris, Tel el-Daba. And we know this through the archaeological record. They occupied this. So it would make sense that when Jacob and his sons and Joseph, he has his family moved to Egypt, they would go to a place where they felt most comfortable, because the Hyksos were Semitic. They were non-Egyptian. So they would have fit in, and it would have made more sense. The Hyksos were eventually dispelled by a pharaoh by the name of Ahmose I, but it makes the most sense. And this site, by the way, has been excavated. The site of Avaris has been excavated for 35 to 40 years by the Austrians, an Austrian archaeologist by the name of Manfred Bitak. And they excavated there, and all the evidence so far, and there's where it is on the satellite, kind of showing you on the Red Sea there. All the evidence so far points to the fact that this is very likely where the Israelites were during the Exodus. This would have been where the Passover occurred, the primary location of the Passover at Avaris. The site is called Tel el-Daba. This would have been the site of Pi-Ramses. The Nile is in a Nile Delta city where Jacob and his family moved in about the year 1876 BC. So think of the year 1776 as the start of America. Think of the start of Israel being in Egypt, 1876. That's how I remember it, 1876. That's when Jacob moved with his family into this area. And so this is a photograph from a few years ago. I did not take this photograph. This is actually from the film Patterns of Evidence. So you may have seen that film, directed by Tim Mahoney. Tim is actually up in the Twin Cities, north of Chicago. I actually spoke with him on the phone. He wanted me to appear on one of the programs, and I don't know if my schedule wouldn't allow, but we kept playing phone tag back and forth and never heard from him again. And so anyway, but I know Tim, great guy, and a lot of my colleagues are on that show. But this is actually from the film. He told me I could use anything. He said, Ted, whatever you want, film, clips, whatever, take it all. So like, great, I will. So this is from Tel el-Daba that they talk about, and they actually go there. And this is a photograph from another friend of mine, a Canadian archaeologist named David Graves. And this is actually a wall there on one of the parts of Avaris that's been excavated. And this wall is actually was created by bricks made without straw. This is a wall of bricks made without straw. And then when you break them apart, you can see the grog. We call it grog in archaeology. When you see a cross-section of a piece of pottery or a brick, we want to know what it's made. Does it have rocks in it? Does it have stone? And sometimes you can see straw or hay. This is a wall that dates to the time when the Israelite presence would have been there, and it was bricks made without straw. Was it made? Do I know with 100%? No, I don't. But it's the right place, the right time, at the right location. It's all right. It's all there. It's not made up. So, you hear the story about, well, they made the Israelites make bricks without straw. Well, there it is. There's a wall, and it's the same time as when we think the Exodus would have occurred. So David sent me this. So here is actual, I will show you this. This is actually when the Exodus will have occurred. This is from the excavation report from Manfred Bitak, the Austrian archaeologist. And I want you to notice on that bottom section, see the Hyksos Palace fortification. Hyksos is in, I'm trying to think of the date. So it's really 1500 BC time frame. and then it goes into Minoan paintings, a military camp, your soldier burials. There was indication that also the Egyptians had garrisons of soldiers there. There's also, according to Manfred B. Tack, before that time, there's a palace district, and there is a place where Asiatics settled. I don't know if I have it on the slide. I think I do. If I don't, I'm going to go ahead and just talk about it now. Why do we think these were Israelites? And how do you know? Here's a great question. It's a question that I had years ago, and I honestly did not know the answer. I'm like, how do you even answer this question? Just like there's no date on a pottery, how do you know an Israelite? Well, there's actually a couple of ways that you can discern a Jewish person in the archaeological record, and especially during this time. Were there certain animals that they did not eat? Yes. Did they have certain kind of houses that they built? Actually, yes. And we know it's called a four-chambered house or a four-roomed house. There was actually like a little small animal pen that they would keep their sheep or goats. They kept them in the house or right near the house with them. And these houses are at Tel El-Daba. And here's the interesting part. They're all there. These four-roomed houses are all there during the time of the Israelite presence from 1876 all the way up to 1446. And 1446, notice what the site becomes. It becomes a graveyard. It becomes abandoned. What happened? Where did everybody go? They're gone. They left. It becomes a sheep burial place. And so these four-roomed houses, guess where they show up? In Israel. They leave Egypt, and they show up. This style of architecture shows up in Israel during the Late Bronze Age. It is in the Late Bronze Age that we believe the conquest happened. Late Bronze Age fits the 40-year wilderness wandering. If the Exodus happened in 1446, they wandered for 40 years, and the first city they come to is the city of Jericho. And do we find Jericho? Yes, we do. Before we get to that, though, something else was discovered at Avaris by Manfred B. Tack. They discovered in the palatial district, we know, we go back to the Old Testament, go back to the book of Exodus, Joseph, of course, what does the Bible say? He becomes the vizier of Egypt, the second in command. He is in control of all the land. And Jacob and his sons, he moves into Egypt. Well, in this palatial district, they found a large palace. It's not Egyptian, but it's not Hyksos, but it's Asiatic. And Asiatic means Jewish or Israeli. It could be a Jew. I mean, it is definitely not Egyptian. And they find, get this, B-Tac and his team find, get this, they find the tomb, 11 tombs, and one other large tomb at the end. And the large tomb is a pyramid-style tomb, and it contains the statue, and the statue was defaced about 20 or 30 years after it was made. Or not 20, 30 years, excuse me, a couple hundred years after it was made. Because this would have been the time of when Jacob actually entered into Egypt, and he died, and he's buried there. Now, there's some debate about this, even among conservatives. One of my colleagues, Doug Petrovich, he believes this is actually Jacob. Other scholars believe this is Joseph. Doug thinks that Joseph would have been buried with a pharaoh that he served in one of the pyramids, and that has been discovered. Some people say that this is actually Jacob. Doug believes this is Jacob. Some people say this is Joseph. But whether it is Jacob or Joseph, it is one of the two, and it has been deliberately defaced by someone who was mad, who was upset about this group of people who did something. Now, there's all kinds of evidence that Egyptians did this, so it wasn't just that they did it to the Hebrews. They did it to everybody that they thought did something wrong to them. But it does fit into the biblical story exactly. This is a picture. This is from Patterns of Evidence. So this is what the large tomb looked like, the pyramid tomb. This is a person of great importance, and inside of this little chamber was the statue. I don't know. What do you guys think? Joseph or Jacob? Could be Joseph. You got the coat of many colors. You know, he has a little staff there with him, indicating that he had control or power. And somebody smashed the face. And the hairstyle is not Egyptian; it is Asiatic. It is the hairstyle of someone who lived in the Levant. in Israel. So back several years ago, when I was in doing my dig, our team took a detour one weekend, and we went over to the city of Nablus, which is in the West Bank. And if you've ever been there, it's, as you know, if you know about Israel, it's got 3 different security zones. There's a security zone A, B, and C. This was Palestinian territory. They called, or the Israelis, they were carried about our safety. And they were like, if you go, you need to get a Palestinian bus driver who knows the language. You know what I'm saying? If you go to Bethlehem. So he knew the area. So we went in there, and I mean, we were the only, there's no other tourists in this area. There's the city of Shechem, the site of Shechem, and then there's that Greek Orthodox church where the well is, Jacob's well. Well, they took us to this place that very likely Joseph was actually taken. This is called a cenotaph. With a C. Cenotaph means a commemorative tomb. And this is in Nablus. And it's actually was burned during the first Intifada. I forgot what year that was. But the Palestinians in this town burned it. Now, Muslims consider Joseph a prophet. I don't know why, but they do. And, of course, they commemorated this tomb. And the only thing left is that large black stone, which is where they say close to his body lay. And somebody in the modern period made like a coffin-looking thing. And so our group was there, and I got to see where his body very likely sat. Now, whether or not it's not there now, we don't think it's there now, but we do think that it was taken further up into Israel at a further date. I asked several of my archaeologist colleagues, and they were like, yeah, it probably was there for a while, and then it was taken and hidden. But the other cool thing about Joseph and his body is that the Bible tells us in Genesis, it says he was embalmed in the manner of the Egyptians, which means he's a mummy, which means that if we find an Egyptian-looking mummy thing in Israel, well, guess who that might be? That might be Joseph. And have we found it yet? No. Could it be found? Absolutely. If the climate's right, it could be found. Now, let me talk about something controversial here a little bit. Now, it's not, I say controversial, only controversial to those who don't believe in the Exodus. So my colleague Doug Petrovich, years ago, was working on a theory that he had, and he worked it out, and it published it, and it's published from Carta in Jerusalem. And if he's right, and I'm not a language person. I'm more of a pottery and a geography person. My area of expertise is in prehistoric, and geography, spatial analysis, and things like that. Doug is a language guy, so I don't have the intellectual chops to know. I think he's right though, for my own reasons. But essentially, I'll just give you the background of this book and what his theory is, and it is remarkable. If he's right, folks, this is awesome, awesome, awesome. What he theorizes is this. So this has been known about for at least 100 years, if not longer, but at least 100 years, going back to the British Egyptologist William Matthew Flinders Petrie. Petrie and others, as they surveyed the Sinai area, the Sinai is in that triangular piece. And let me go back a couple of slides. I think I'll show you the Sinai, that map of the satellite map. Remember the satellite map we were looking at earlier? This right here. So the Sinai Peninsula, right here. All in here, these are turquoise mines. And we believe, and some Bible scholars believe, that basically the Egyptians used, and Joseph, because he was in command, allowed his brothers to be in charge of the turquoise mines there in the Sinai Peninsula. And what they discovered, what Petrie and other archaeologists discovered, is outside these turquoise mines at Wadi El Hol, Sarabat El Khadim, many other sites, these were known. There were also Egyptian garrisons also in these areas as well. But they found these stelae, which are essentially like a large tombstone-looking object, and they have this language on these stelae that no one knows what it is. Is it Egyptian? It's not quite Hebrew, but it has elements very close to Hebrew. And they don't know what it is. And it's called the Proto-Consonantal script or the Proto-Sinaitic script. There's different names for it. So there was a German archaeologist, scholar back in the 1800s, or excuse me, early 1900s, named Hubert Grimme, and Grimme proposed that these inscriptions in the Sinai Peninsula are actually the beginnings of Hebrew. They have elements of Egyptian hieroglyphics, pictographic. They're partly pictographic, and pictographic writing or hieroglyphics is it's only consonants, not vowels. So, for instance, the Egyptian word for Egypt is Kemet, K-M-T. There's no E's. It's K-M-T, which means the black land. But on these Proto-Sinaitic inscriptions, you've got the pictographic symbols, some of them similar to Egyptian, some of them are not, but then you have things that look consonantal. So essentially what Hubert Grimme proposed was that this proto-consonantal script is ancient Hebrew. This is the beginnings of Hebrew. And so Doug has taken that theory and looked at all the inscriptions and all the best inscriptions and has worked out in a moment that could be possibly like Rosetta Stone moment, like when Champollion deciphered the Rosetta Stone in France. Petrovich may have undeciphered the earliest forms of Hebrew, and he has translated some of the monuments found in the Sinai Peninsula, and they are remarkable. And guess whose name pops up? Moses. Yes, and Manasseh, and many of the patriarchs, and what they say are amazing. So let me go back to the slide and pick up where we are. That's actually from one of the scripts. That's actually one of the Hebrews, Manasseh and Hebedeb. You have to read Doug's book. He talks about this a lot. And I've got more slides to show you, so hang on this. So there is the book. Let me go back and find the book here. The book that you can buy online. I think you can get it on Amazon. You can also get it on Carta, Jerusalem. But the subtitle here is Hebrew as the Language of the Proto-Consonantal Script. And so here's a little context. The question is, where did Hebrew come from? Language scholars, now you and I believe it came from the Hebrews. But if you're an archaeologist or a scholar, you have to historically figure out where it came from. Did it come from the Canaanites? Did it come from Ugarit in Syria? Or did it come from Egypt? What do you think, folks? It's got to come from Egypt. If the Israelites really were in Egypt, then it makes sense that Joseph or one of his brothers would have created a language so that they could actually communicate with each other and communicate with the Egyptians. It makes sense. It just makes a lot of sense. The reason why scholars have had such a knee-jerk reaction against Petrovich's theory is because 99% of them categorically reject the Exodus altogether. There was no Exodus. It can't be the Hebrews because we all know there wasn't an Exodus. Now, they have other reasons, but I think that's one of the reasons. But this is remarkable. This is one of the translations of these Proto-Sinaitic script. 6 Levantines, Hebrews of Bethel, the beloved. Who came from Bethel? Jacob and his sons came from Bethel. This is Sinai 115, 1842 BC, the 18th year of Amenemhat III. There is Shechem there leading his son Hebedeb on the donkey, and he's translated the script there. The inscription names these Hebrews as being from the Levant, that is foreigners, specifically from Bethel, which is called the beloved. All the patriarchs, of course, they viewed Bethel as their capital before the Exodus. And this was discovered in 1905 at Serebet El Khadim in the Sinai Peninsula. Now, you're not going to see this on the news. You're not going to see this on the History Channel. And it's very controversial, even among conservatives. Some scholars say, well, how do we know Petrovich is right? I mean, how do you know he's wrong? I mean, I tend to think he's right. Again, I'm not a language scholar, but I think it makes the most sense. Well, there are some more. This is actually his chart in the book, charting the pictographic development of this language and the similarities between Canaanite, Ugaritic, and other languages. So you'll have to buy the book and see and read it for yourself to see if you think he's right. This also, by the way, is on one of the Patterns of Evidence documentary films. This whole thing about, and they interview people who disagree with him. But he says that it actually is, and I think he's right. This is the one that's most amazing to me. This is called the Moses inscription, or what's the, I forgot the actual, where is it? I'm trying to think of, there's actually another name for it, but let me just read it. Essentially, it says, "Our bound servitude had lingered." These are now again, Jewish Hebrew turquoise miners mining turquoise in the Sinai Peninsula, and they're writing things, commemorating events, and they're commemorating, "Our bound servitude had lingered. We were slaves," and it just went on and on and on. "Moses then provoked astonishment. It is the year of astonishment because of the lady." 1446 BC. This is the date of the Exodus. Now, it's Sinai 361. That's what I was looking for. Through Sinai 361. Here's the crazy thing about this. These inscriptions, these Proto-Sinaitic inscriptions, guess when they stop being inscribed? After 1446. There are no more. I mean, what else could it be? You know? And the other curious thing about this is this last part has always, sort of puzzled me. But as I started to dig into this, I thought, hey, it makes sense. If you're a Hebrew in Egypt for 400 years, you're going to start thinking like an Egyptian, aren't you? You're going to start giving honor to the Egyptian gods. You're going to start maybe a little bit here, a little bit there, Well, I mean, yeah, our ancestors worshiped God, Abraham, God of Abraham, but, I got Anubis on the side here. I got Amun-Ra, I got an Amun-Ra necklace, or I've got a Horus necklace or whatever. And so they're thoroughly Egyptianized. So when they get word that there's a great deliverance coming out of Egypt, coming out of the north from Avaris, they get word, hey, we're going to go join these folks. And so they made this monument and said, hey, we were slaves here for so many years, but now we're going to be set free. And now this guy named Moses came and provoked astonishment. It is the year of astonishment because of the lady. What is that referring to? Very likely an Egyptian god or goddess, probably Isis, or it could be one of the female fertility bulls. And what do the Israelites do as Moses is getting the Torah, getting the words, getting the Ten Commandments? They're worshiping a golden cow right after the Exodus. Well, it makes sense. They're thoroughly Egyptianized. And so that is why, even right here at the very beginning of the Exodus, they're ascribing their deliverance to not God, but these pagan Egyptian gods. Now, is that right? No, they shouldn't do that, but I think that is very likely what's going on. But it is remarkable. So, again, not widely accepted because people debate as to whether or not Petrovich has actually deciphered them correct. But I'll tell you what is unequivocally not up for debate. What is not up for debate is that, number one, that these are actual inscriptions found in the Sinai Peninsula, that they are workers, and that it is a Semitic language. It could be any one of Semitic languages. But what's the one that makes the most sense? Who would have been there to begin with? The Hebrews. And what motivation would they have had to create a language partially out of hieroglyphics and partially in a consonantal script? It makes the most sense. Does it answer every question? No, but it makes the most sense. I personally think that it's genuine. But again, some discovery could prove it wrong, but I've not read anything yet, any criticism that I think has dealt the death blow to this theory about the proto-consonantal script. Moses, of course, as Stephen says, was educated in all the learning of the Egyptians. He was a man of power in word and deed. And if that is the case, I'm going to skip this because we don't have time to get into this. The internal evidence for the Exodus is remarkable. We could spend days on that. Napoleon, of course, discovers, he himself personally doesn't discover it. He's a lieutenant by the name of Pierre Bouchard and his army engineers basically reinforcing a wall, they found this huge slab of granite with the 3 scripts on it, and this is what it would have looked like. It was a victory stele, and they didn't really know how to read it, obviously. And the funny, interesting story about the Rosetta Stone was that it was taken a little while later by the British. The British, blockaded by Admiral Nelson, they blockaded the port of Alexandria. Napoleon went back to France, and eventually the British confiscated many of the artifacts that the French were getting under Napoleon. One of them was the Rosetta Stone. They took it back to England in the British Museum, which is where it is today. And so a race, after Napoleon was defeated at the Battle of Waterloo, a race went out as to who was going to decipher the Rosetta Stone. And so there was a race. It was sort of a national pride thing. And England had their guy, Thomas Young, who was sort of the Elon Musk of England at the time. And he was smart. And it was like, oh, if anybody can do it, Thomas Young can do it. And Young was a really smart guy, and he did a lot of work. And actually, in the early work, discovered about the whole thing about the cartouche. He did get the idea that and deciphered one of the names in the cartouches as being, I think it was either Ptolemy or I think it was Ptolemy. He deciphered, he knew Ptolemy in the Greek, and he was able to decipher Ptolemy in the cartouche. But he could not work out actually how the language worked. It wasn't until Champollion, because Champollion had actually taught himself Coptic by the age of 16. And so because of his knowledge of the Coptic language, Champollion was able to take Thomas Young further, and eventually in the 1820s, eventually decipher the Rosetta Stone. So when that happened, that literally opened the door up to all of Egypt, and now we can understand all of these myths and all these legends of ancient Egypt. And it really gives us insight into the Old Testament. That's Champollion with his hand in his jacket like Napoleon. And the language is, of course, Greek on the bottom, the middle language is Demotic, and the top language is hieroglyphics. So one of the things that they, as these scholars, there was a whole big flurry of scholarship. Egyptology was just really getting off the rails then, and one of the very first things they published is something known popularly as the Egyptian Book of the Dead. That's actually not the original. The Egyptian title of this book is called the Book of Going Forth by Day. That's what the Egyptians call it. They didn't call it the Book of the Dead. They call it the Book of Going Forth by Day because they believed that the soul of the person, the Ba, would survive and go into the afterlife. And these spells would actually help your soul, to actually enter into heaven in the afterlife, and you would have everything you needed to live in the afterlife. Now, the best book on this, I think, when understanding the Old Testament, one of my favorite books is by John Currid called Against the Gods. I don't have time to get into a lot of the details in this, but I do want to make mention of something called polemical theology, which essentially is something that we see all throughout the Old Testament. It's God using, the biblical writers using the myths and the legends of the pagan nations in which they were in and around, and using them to show that God was the true God. And here he says it this way: the polemical theology is the use by biblical writers of the thought forms and stories that were common in ancient Near Eastern culture, while filling them with radically new meaning. They were monotheistic to the core. So the biblical writers are defending God. He's the true God, the righteous. There are no other gods. There's no Egyptian gods. There's no, but they're using this against them. And we see this in the Exodus account. Moses does this as well. In fact, in the Book of the Dead, one of the things that we discover is something called the Great Judgment. The 42 judges, and then you have there above, and in different forms of Egyptian gods. You have Anubis there kneeling down under the scales, and on the other side is the Pharaoh and his wife, and they're in the afterlife, and they're bowing down, and this is the judgment of the heart. The heart of the Pharaoh is going to be weighed in the scale balances against the feather of Ma'at. And Ma'at is an Egyptian goddess, but also a concept, which really can be translated as cosmic order. The Pharaoh was instituted by the Egyptian gods Amun-Ra and Osiris and Ma'at to keep order in Egypt. There was always forces trying to get Egypt off balance. And the way to do that was to keep your heart soft. And what do we see in the plagues? We see cosmic order way out of balance. The Nile is flooding. The Nile's turning to blood, rather, excuse me. There are plagues. These are the Egyptian gods that are completely out of control. The Pharaoh is not keeping Ma'at. But throughout the plagues and throughout each plague, what does the text say? And Pharaoh hardened his heart. Pharaoh hardened his heart. Pharaoh hardened his heart. And as he's hardening his heart, it's getting heavier and heavier and heavier until he's going to be judged in the afterlife. And when this happens, if the heart was heavy and outweighed the feather of truth, then the heart will be cast into the mouth of the crocodile god. It's being recorded by Thoth, the god of scribes, the god of records. And, of course, throughout this whole thing, the Pharaoh would be doing prayers and incantations to keep his heart soft. One of the other things he would do, he was actually have a scarab wrapped in his mummy wrappings placed over his heart. So if you ever go to a museum and you see a scarab over the heart of the Pharaoh, it actually will contain an inscription meant to keep the heart soft over the heart. So this is really amazing. And we would not have this insight if we did not have the idea of the hardening of the heart. So this illuminates the text. One of the functions of archaeology is it illuminates the text. And this is the prayer here from the Book of the Dead. This is from the Book of Ani about a prayer, keeping the heart soft and saying that I've kept true to my heart. The scarab there had a spell, and we placed over the heart. One of the other elements that we see, Egyptian elements we see in the Exodus, is the serpent motif. We only see it in the Exodus. We also see it in the beginning of the Torah, in the book of Genesis. Now, the snake was more crafty among all the creatures of the world, and it deceived Eve. To the Egyptians, the serpent was the female cobra actually represented Lower Egypt in the north. It was its own god. And it actually, on the crown of the Pharaoh, there were two kinds of crowns. There was the red crown of Lower Egypt, or Upper Egypt rather, Lower Egypt, and the white crown of Upper Egypt. So you had the two crowns together. The red and the white crown is called the pshent. And when you had that wearing on the Pharaoh's reigning over all of Egypt. But also, the other iconography for Upper and Lower Egypt is the snake and the vulture. The snake represented the god of the delta in the north. The vulture represented the god of the desert in the south. And so whenever Pharaoh is wearing a double crown with the snake and the vulture, like King Tut here, that means he's reigning over all of Egypt. Now, what does Moses and Aaron, they do something rather curious. When they go before Pharaoh, what does Moses do? What does God tell Moses and Aaron? See that staff in your hand? Throw it down. What does it turn into? It turns into a serpent. Now, we just skip over that and go, that's kind of cool magical trick. That was a throwdown. That was like, you think you are in control? Let me show you let me show you who's in control here. And the Hebrew is actually really amazing in this, because it says in that whole little pericope of Moses and Aaron confronting Pharaoh and his magicians with the serpent, a symbol of their own country, a symbol of their own nation. And it says that Moses and Aaron's staff consumed the staff of the Pharaoh's magicians. It consumed them. In other words, it swallowed them whole, swallowed them up. Different words used for that. But it literally consumed means to completely engulf. It's that same staff that when Moses gets to the Red Sea, he holds it up, and the exact same phrase is used. And when they crossed over on dry land, they were safe, and he held the staff up, and the staff, the water consumed the armies of Pharaoh. So the polemical theology here, that's a true story, it really happened, but it's making a statement that God is the true God. So all these Egyptian elements are all throughout the Pentateuch, and all throughout the Exodus story, which to me lends credibility to the fact that they were written by an eyewitness. And by the way, each of the plagues correspond to an Egyptian god. So these Egyptian gods were supposed to be in control of these certain things. The Nile was supposed to be controlled by Osiris and Hapi and Khnum, the frogs, the god of resurrection. There were other Nile gods, various names depending on where you were in Egypt, the gnats and the flies, the plague of the cattle. Cattle was a huge thing, the fertility of cattle. Of course, there was a plague of the cattle. This would have been a direct attack on one of the most important gods in Egypt, one of the oldest gods in Egypt, the boils, the god of medicine, Imhotep. And then finally, we get down to the 10th plague. It essentially is a confrontation of the divinity of Pharaoh himself. Pharaoh was supposed to be the son of Horus, who was the son of Osiris. And the Osiris myth, you may or may not know the Osiris myth, but Osiris, who was created by the gods, and his wife Isis, and Osiris's brother Set was jealous and killed his brother and cut his body up and spread it all over the earth. This is the myth, okay? But his wife, Isis, collected the body parts of her husband, Osiris, and she bandaged them back together with linen bandages. And so they had a son by the name of Horus. And Horus was the son of Osiris and Isis. And so he was able to continue the kingly line. Osiris was asked, do you want to come back from the dead and reign on earth? No, I will let my son do this. So by the king saying, he was also the god of, so this is where embalming happens. This is why the embalming process is so important in Egypt, because they're trying to connect that with the Horus myth and with the Osiris myth. And so essentially, when the Pharaoh wore the crown with the snake and the vulture, he is representing the gods of Osiris and Horus and all the imagery of the falcon imagery. And it was essentially that your name, the name by which your son is going to carry on, and in fact, Egyptians were all about the name. In fact, they had huge debates about how they had 5 different names for the Pharaoh. They had the Horus name. They had the all kinds of different names. They had the throne name, and they could change it. In fact, interestingly, one of the heretic kings, well, he's called the heretic king, Akhenaten. You may have know who Akhenaten is. He wanted Egypt to worship the sun disk, Aten, and his son, by his wife Nefertiti, and I forget the exact title of it, but it was a name like that gave honor to Aten, and Aten was in his name. And so all these names, these pharaohs' names, would reflect something about what they wanted to accomplish. And that son's name was, we know him by his popular name, not the name that his father gave him, because he changed his name. That was Tutankhamun. He changed his name because the priest at Thebes said, we're not going to have this Aten worship. You better change your name, son. I don't know if they said that, but he did change his name. So he had his birth name, and then he had his name that he changed after. And then King Tut was actually killed when he actually died when he was about 19 years of age. So your name would be carried on through your offspring, and so by God taking out the firstborn, he's essentially saying, your name's not going to survive. You're not God. You're not God's representative. I am the giver of life. I'm the taker of life. So this is powerful stuff here. This is the Egyptian, what I call the Egyptian coloring of the Exodus. One other thing about the name, let me just say it, and we're just getting in out of time here, and I haven't gotten to Jericho yet. Y'all want Jericho? You may get to Jericho? Do we have time to get to Jericho? Up to me. I'll do Jericho next. I'm going to go back and change it right to Jericho. Before I do that, let me say something else about the name. So with the name, there's another story about Isis and about Amun-Ra and about the name, okay? And I'm leading somewhere with this, so hang with me here. So the story was found, I think, I forgot where it was discovered, but it was in a papyrus manuscript. It dates to about the 19th dynasty, which that was the dynasty of Ramses II. That doesn't matter. What matters is this is about the name, the importance of the name, and the name of the gods, and the name of the Pharaoh, and how important the name was. The name is important, and what you call someone is important, and who you call them by their proper name. So, essentially, Amun-Ra and Isis. Amun-Ra, in the story, wanders around the earth as an old man, as an old man. Now, why he doesn't say why he's doing that. He's wandering around as an old man, and his mouth is drooling, and he's wandering around with his cane. His mouth is drooling. So Isis, in the story, she goes behind him, and we know that Amun-Ra can give life. In fact, what's interesting is that Amun-Ra has power over things by calling them by their names. He can call things into existence by calling them their right name. Isn't it interesting? So she gets there, and he only has power over those things if he knows their names. If he doesn't know their name, he doesn't have power over them. So she knew this, but she knew that he had a name that only he knew, and she wanted to get that name for her son Horus, okay, because his father had been killed by Set. So she goes behind him, and she gets some of the saliva that fell on the ground and the mud, and she makes a snake with it. And she rolls it up and breathes life, she does some magic stuff, and this little clay snake comes alive, and it bites Amun-Ra, who's in this old man. It stings, what is this? And so she goes, oh, a snake must have bitten you, Well, I bet if you say the snake's name, the venom, the stinging will stop. And so he starts calling out all these snake names and whatever, and he doesn't relieve his pain. And then, so she knows the name of the snake because she's the one who made it. She knows the proper name of the snake. And so finally, through a bunch of trickster tricks that she has up her sleeve, she finally tricks and convinces him to she said, I will give you the name of the snake if you will give me the true name of your true name. And so he does, and he gives her the name of the snake. Here's the thing about that whole story is that the name is important and how you know the name. Essentially, the Egyptians could manipulate God by saying his name. They could get their will done by saying God's name. If you said the right name, if you know the right name, well, we got the right name of God, so we got power now, but we can get what we want now. I know the name of God. What does the third commandment say? Thou shalt not take the name of the Lord thy God's name in vain. Wow. You see the Egyptian coloring now? God is essentially saying in the third commandment, I will not be manipulated by my name. This is my name, yes, but I'm not like these gods. You cannot magically say my name and I do what you want. I do what I want. I am the great I am. You're not, and by saying my name and by manipulating my name and trying to make it a magic spell, you're not gonna get your will that way. I'm going to do what I'm going to do. And so that's the danger. The danger is, we think of like the third commandment, saying God's name in vain, as saying, God's name is a curse word. And that's bad. We shouldn't do that. It is profaning God's name. Not to be clear about that, or to be clear about that, that's not a good thing. But is that what the original commandment meant? I don't think so. I think it had to do with the Egyptians and their effect on the Israelites, and they thinking that they could somehow manipulate God by saying his name. Now they know his name. They didn't know his name before, but Moses has to ask him, what is your name? Well, I am that I am. I'm the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. And so now that they have the name, hey, did you hear the name of God? Yes, it's I am. Yeah, I got that name now. I know what I can do now. And God says, wait a minute, hang on. You cannot say my name in vain. Do not just utter my name thinking that you can snap your fingers and get your will. So, Jericho, are we good? All right, 10 minutes. All right, we'll go 10 minutes over. Let me go back here real quick and change the slides. Sorry about that. You're getting bonus material here. No extra charge, exactly. All right, we're going to start out with Basic Archaeology 101. We'll be pretty thorough here, but kind of go through this quickly. This is called a tell. You probably have seen this before. You've seen the word before. This is actually just an illustration. And a tell, of course, is an artificial mound of a city that's been built up over time. And 99.99% of archaeologists in Israel and the Levant, in Turkey, we are trained, all of our training is in tell archaeology and stratigraphy and how to excavate tells. And we excavate tells by pottery. We're able to tell the different layers by the changes in the pottery. And the pottery styles change over time, and the pottery also helps us to date the different layers in the tell. And that's a science that's been developed for many, many years. And there's still debates about exactly some of the crossover time periods. You know, is it late Bronze 1, late Bronze 2? There's subdivisions and things like that. But now there is a pretty good consensus as to exactly when things can be dated to in the archaeological record. So that is what a tell looks like from a chart there. But this is actually an actual tell Jericho, Tell El Sultan. It is one of the oldest occupied cities in the world. The earliest dates of Jericho date back to the pre-pottery Neolithic. So we're talking about really, really old. This is like cavemen days. This is really old stuff. There is a great battle that's still raging today. This is a site of the Battle of Jericho. It was first studied in 1869 by Charles Warren, and then in 1913 by Sellen and Watzinger, two German archaeologists, and then in 1930, 1936 by John Garstang. John Garstang excavated Jericho with a team from the Oriental Institute at the University of Chicago. And he was a British archaeologist, but he was the chief excavator for 6 years. And then in the late 1940s, there was the interwar period, of course, 1939 to 1945. There was no excavation. And then in the late 1940s, Kathleen Kenyon came along, and she continued. Jericho is actually a very, very large archaeological site. You can see there from the road how large it is, and it's still not been fully excavated. Bryant Wood has done some work there as well. I'll talk about him in a moment. We're only going to go a couple of minutes over, probably 10 minutes, but I want to give you the essence of Jericho. It has been discovered, and we know it was destroyed. The debate is over when it was destroyed. When was the site destroyed? So to look at it from the bottom, from the top looking down, it is actually a double-walled city. You have a revetment wall, you have a plastered rampart, and you have an inner city wall. According to the Bible says that Jericho was very well fortified, and the Israelites could not conquer it just by their own. It was a very well fortified city, double-walled. And not only double-walled, but on the revetment walls, revetment wall is like a ramp about 15 to 20 feet high, and on top of the ramp, you have another 15 to 20 foot high vertical wall. So you have about 40 feet of vertical wall you've got to climb before you get into Jericho. And once you get over that section, you have a whole nother inner wall that you have to conquer. So it's a very well fortified site. And it was a double wall fortress. This is a black and white photograph of John Garstang. I love these old excavation photographs. They're great with the pith helmet. By the way, this is how we dress on an archaeological site. No, I wish. That would be really cool. You probably get dirty very quickly if you wore white. But to go back to pottery typology, essentially the basic idea is that pottery styles change over time. This is the basic idea. These changes can help us to date the layers of a tell. And so keep that in mind. So this is an actual photograph of what we think may have happened when the walls collapse. The Bible tells us, and when you read the account of the destruction of Jericho, you got to read it very carefully, because the Bible gives you everything you need to know to find it. And there is a passage in the Jericho section of Joshua, the book of Joshua, of the destruction of Jericho. Is it Joshua 6? I think it's right. Joshua 6. It says the walls fell beneath themselves. How does a wall fall beneath itself? Well, if you are an army, just from a practical standpoint, if you are an invading army and you see a wall and you're going to be pushing from which direction? Outside in, right? You're going to get a battering ram or get a big, a log, and you're going to try to batter your way through the wall, through the gate or whatever. But when we batter through the wall, where are the stones going to fall? They're going to fall inside the city. These stones are actually outside the city, not just in one section, but in two sections. There are two sections in which the walls are breached, not from the outside, but from the inside out, which would indicate some type of violent earthquake or a shaking of the earth of some sort. And not only that, the walls, these revetment walls below, when the bricks from the walls fell, they actually formed a ramp up into the city. But one more thing. Selin and Watzinger, years before Garstang, this is based on Garstang and Selin and Watzinger's excavation reports, they also discovered a casemate wall. We talked about casemate walls earlier, like Hezekiah built the casemate wall in Jerusalem. Well, Jericho had an early form of casemate wall and had windows facing out of the city. Why is that important? Why is that detail important? Because how did Joshua and the spies, how were they able to spy out Jericho? Because of Rahab, and where did she live? On the wall. And when they escaped, where did they get? They left out of one of the windows. Well, guess what they found? That's exactly what they found. The German excavators found the outward-facing walls of Jericho that were facing outside the city, and this revetment wall was breached. And so here are some discoveries at Jericho that affirm Joshua. It was heavily fortified at the time of the conquest. The piles of brick from the base of the collapsed city wall verifies Joshua 6:20, that the walls fell beneath themselves. The wall falls beneath itself. The earthen embankment required that Israel go up into the city. You're going to go up through climbing up the ramp. And that is what the walls did. The walls, when they collapsed, formed a ramp, and they went up into the city. The next thing, it says that some of the houses were built into the lower city wall and did not collapse, verifying that Rahab's, number one, verifying her house location, but also, I think it's on here as well. No, it's not on 4, but I could also say about number 4, some of the houses were not destroyed. Some of them were destroyed, some of them were not destroyed. And there are only 2 sections of the wall that were breached. But it allowed the Israelites to go up into the city and to actually attack it. There is a layer 3 feet thick of ash and timbers that indicates that the Israelites burned the entire city and everything in it. Why is that the case? Joshua 6:24. Anybody know why? This is a theological question, really. Why did God tell them to burn it? I mean, it was during the fall of the year, too, when harvest was being taken. Does anybody know? The Bible tells us the reason why. It was a first fruits, burnt offering. Basically, that when they go into the land to conquer the land, just like they are to give the first fruits, this is God who gave this. So we're giving it back to you as an offering. And so it was burnt. That's according to what the Bible says. And they found the whole site was burnt. So this doesn't make sense. If the Egyptians conquered Jericho or any other nation, why would they burn all the stuff when it was full of grain? It doesn't make sense. It only makes sense if it was Israelites who were commanded to burn the city exactly as the Bible states. So the destruction occurred at the end of the 15th century B.C., the exact time of the conquest, from the internal consistency of the biblical text, 1 Kings 6:1. Also, I did not mention in Judges and also in Chronicles, the Jubilee cycles were also counted from the conquest. And when you count for the Jubilee cycles and you look at 1 Kings 6:1, that still gives you an internal biblical date of the Exodus and conquest, the Exodus being 1446 and the conquest beginning in about 1406 to 1401 B.C. So this is all lines up with what we see. The next thing is we have large jars full of burnt grains in the destroyed buildings. The large amount of grain indicates that the harvest had just been taken. That's what the Bible says. They just took the harvest. So every detail has been discovered. The siege was short, lasting 7 days, and the Israelites did not plunder the city. They were commanded not to plunder the city. Now, I have with me not a piece of pottery from Jericho, but I have a piece of pottery from the second city the Israelites fought and destroyed, the city of Ai, and it was also burned. This is a piece of pottery from that site of Ai, of Kerbet El Makader, and you can see the burned scorch marks on the pottery. You can hold this in your hand. This pottery is 3,400 years old. This is physical evidence that the Bible is true. The Bible is accurate. The stories really happen, and they should encourage us. Remember what Joshua 4 says when the Israelites crossed over into the dry land at a place called Abel Shittim, the place of the crossing, and God commanded Joshua, erect masabah, standing stones, and remember this spot. And there's going to come a day in which your children are going to ask you, what do these stones mean? You tell them all the great and mighty things God has done. My prayer for this whole session and really our talk today has been that very thing, that you remember what God has done. God is the same yesterday, today, and forever. He is mighty to save. He is waiting for us to trust him and still do mighty things in his name, in his hands, so that he will be glorified and that we will be saved. But Jericho was discovered exactly as the Bible states. Let me couple more slides, and then we'll be done. This is actually a cross-section of Kathleen Kenyon, who dug in the 1948, 1950s, showing us the revetment wall in the black little strip there, and then the yellow is the backfill. The red brick on the left triangle is the bricks going up into the city. So the red bricks are the ramp, and the wall is the revetment wall that had fallen down. Now, the debate today is over Kathleen Kenyon. Did she actually redate the conquest, or did she redate Jericho? Yes, she redates City 4 of Jericho. And so if you see a documentary today, if you read any articles about Jericho, what you're going to read is Kathleen Kenyon's excavation report. That's what gets the airtime today. But the question is, did she get it right? And I'm going to argue no, she did not. For the reasons of pottery, not because we think she's wrong with the Bible, which I think she is, but it has to do with something called Cypriot bichrome pottery. Now, very quickly, there's a kind of pottery that was made in the late Bronze Age called Cypriot pottery from Cyprus. And there are two kinds of Cypriot pottery. One is was locally made Cypriot pottery, and the other was imported pottery. Imported Cypriot pottery, whenever you find that, it will date it to a particular time, to the late Bronze Age. And then the locally made pottery dates it to a certain age as well. And so what they find is this Cypriot bichrome pottery, which indicates the late Bronze Age 1 period in Israel. So when Kathleen Kenyon came along, she was excavating at a certain area at Jericho, but there were other areas that she did not excavate. Well, in the area that she excavated, she did not find Cypriot pottery. Now, does that mean that it did not exist? No. In fact, when Bryant Wood went back and did a survey, the area that Kathleen Kenyon did not excavate in the same layer had Cypriot pottery in the droves, which would have dated, which would have continued to affirm the Garstang date. And so what date, though, got recorded for posterity's sake for the destruction of City 4? City 4, by the way, is our Jericho. City 4. City 4 Jericho is the destruction of Jericho by Joshua. Kathleen Kenyon redates it because she doesn't find Cypriot pottery. But there is Cypriot pottery in other areas that indicates the late Bronze Age. Now, it seems like squabbling over details, but folks, this is if Kathleen Kenyon's right, there's no conquest, basically. Jericho did not happen. So what I ask people who don't like the early day of the Exodus, okay, fine. I mean, you're going to agree with Kathleen Kenyon. Well, then show me where the conquest is. Because this is Jericho. This is Jericho. There's no doubt about that. Then where is the conquest? Where is it? Tell me which city. City 4, City 2, City 1. You can trace the destruction levels of Jericho, and you can look at the archaeology. But if it's not City 4 and Kathleen Kenyon is correct, then you just have to take that little story of the Jericho, Joshua. You just have to it probably didn't happen. Probably just made up. But I just can't go there. I'm not going to go there because I think the evidence is overwhelming that it was destroyed exactly as the Bible states. And so that's where I'm going to put my money. And one last thing here, according to Judges 3, a Moabite king by the name of Eglon built a palace on the ruins of Jericho during the period of the Judges, and he extracted tribute for about 20 years from the Israelites. Now, guess what was found on the ruins of Jericho? John Garstang discovered a middle building in between the Iron Age structures of the 15th century and City 4, matching the description exactly. He found Eglon's palace built on top of the ruins of Jericho. The building dates to the second half of the 14th century, the time of Eglon's oppression, which really gives us some really great dates for the destruction and the sealing of the date of the early date of the Exodus and the conquest. The plan of the building is similar to other palaces of the period and fits the description given in the Bible. The building was an isolated structure, as the Bible implies, and the resident was wealthy by, guess what? The imported Cypriot pottery. There it goes again. Now you know about Cypriot pottery. Cypriot is Cyprus. Whenever you find imported, it's wealthy. It indicates the late Bronze Age, and that's what we find. And this is actually a picture of the middle building excavated by John Garstang. So that, in a nutshell, is just scratching the top of Jericho, but that's the main argument, that we believe that Kathleen Kenyon was incorrect in her redating of John Garstang, that Garstang was correct, and that the city was destroyed in the late Bronze Age in about 1401 BC. So thank you guys so much. It's been a great honor to be with you, and I'm going to be here. Thank you. So we have a microphone in the back. Do we have a microphone, or do I have the microphone? I have the microphone. All right, I'll go around. Oh, you have a microphone. All right. So questions or comments? We've got a few minutes left. No questions. Yes. Are you kidding me? She always has questions.
So I guess just to summarize from the beginning, you said there's 3 forms of evidence, right? And so what I think you've shown in the archaeological view are all of the artifacts that corroborate all of the text.
Yes.
That's all I needed.
Yes, the artifacts that corroborate the text.
So
The text itself is so if there's a God, and which there is, scrolls, we have the manuscript evidence, we have so the archaeology and the scrolls and the historical text, of course, they claim to be written by eyewitnesses, and they're only accurate if we can go find out if the archaeology matches what we read in the text. And that's exactly what we find. Now, has every story been found in the Bible? No, but most of the stories have been discovered, and we find little bits and pieces here and there, and many of the things are discovered by people not setting out to prove the Bible. Now, what about Jesus, though? What about the New Testament? Let's get back to the story about the Messiah. Now, the New Testament has got, it amazes me how many people doubt the New Testament historical reliability. It just amazes me. I mean, the Old Testament is one thing. The New Testament, we have found every major New Testament city, every major Roman official has been discovered archaeologically. No one doubts that any of these Roman officials existed. The only people that, and now they're among internet atheists today, there is those who are just really, it's like the flat earth theory of New Testament scholarship. It's called Jesus mythicism. And it's the people who deny that Jesus ever existed. I mean, it's like, well, how do we even know he existed? I'm like, do you even understand history? Do you understand how history works? If you deny that Jesus existed, then you have to deny Julius Caesar and many other people who we have less evidence for than Jesus. So it's really, really bad, the Jesus mythicism movement, and there's some really good books written about against that. So the Bible gives us accurate historical information that Jesus rose from the dead. The other book that you can check out is by my former colleague, Frank Turek, and Norm Geisler, my mentor, called, and it's a funny name, and I remember when they wrote this book, it's called I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist. I don't have enough faith to be an atheist. That's the name of the book. And it was kind of meant to be tongue-in-cheek. Dr. Geisler kind of just threw that out there and said, oh, we should just name the book that. But in the book, they get into the entire case for Christianity, and they get into the disciples. Like, if one of the things that people say about the New Testament is that, well, maybe they just made it up. Maybe they just thought they saw Jesus rise from the dead. You know, maybe it's got some historical stuff to it. But when you look at what did any of them have to gain? In fact, the Bible contains embarrassing detail, eyewitness information, and it actually bears the detail that an eyewitness would have. And sometimes there's a little differences in eyewitnesses. Like you'll have people who witness a crash site, and some people saw it this way, some people saw it that way, and there's differences, but they agree on the core thing. A good example that I like to give on the eyewitness example is when the Titanic sank in 1912. There were survivors. There were people who survived in the water. They were in the lifeboats, and interestingly, there's conflicting accounts by the survivors of the Titanic about what happened when it sank. Because one group says the ship broke in half, and the other group said the ship just sank. There was no breaking in half. And so there was this, for years, or these people making this up, I mean, they all agreed that the ship sank. That is not up for debate. The debate was over the detail of the eyewitness account. And so what is the only way that we could discern whether or not the ship broke in half? In 1987, Robert Ballard went to the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean. They found the Titanic, and guess what? Broke in half. In fact, the bow was like almost a mile from the stern, and they found it through the debris field. The thing broke off, and it just, planed off and dove into the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean. And so the point of that is that that archaeology verifies the eyewitnesses who said the ship broke in half. And that can do the same thing for the New Testament. The Apostle Paul, of course, wrote his letters, and he wrote to real churches at real places. Corinth, we know, there's first century Corinth, the things he writes about. The theater at Ephesus, there's a theater at Ephesus. There's these gods, that he talks about. The book of Acts, written by Luke, who wrote the Gospel of Luke, records the missionary journeys of the Apostle Paul. There's a great book. It's a little scholarly, but it's very good. It's about the book of Acts. It's about the historicity, the Roman accurate historical details in the book of Acts. It's called The Book of Acts in a Setting of Hellenistic History by Colin Hemer, H-E-M-E-R, Hemer. The Book of Acts in the Setting of Hellenistic History. And it is a remarkable book, and it details accurate historical information about the book of Acts that only an eyewitness would know. For instance, we know from the book of Acts that the Apostle Paul sailed to Rome, and he sailed along the Aegean coast. We know also that Paul was shipwrecked 3 times. And it tells us, Luke gives us details about the direction the wind was flowing and which island they landed. They landed on Malta. They landed here. They landed there. Well, historians have taken Luke and book of Acts, and they have found everything he said exactly to be true. Everything they've examined. In fact, there was, in the 19th century, there was a classical scholar by the name of William Ramsay. And Ramsay studied the book of Acts and was kind of just looking at it a little bit, I don't know if this thing is true or not, ended up becoming a believer from just studying the book of Acts and the historical reliability. And you can get that book. It's called St. Paul the Traveler by William Ramsay. That book today is edited by a friend of mine who lives in Turkey, Mark Wilson. Mark Wilson is an American who leads trips to the 7 churches in Asia Minor in Turkey today. And Mark edited that volume on William Ramsay. But it is an accurate historical document. And it's giving us accurate historical information. Then it actually, again, the case for Jesus as the Messiah is all together. It's a large case. The other thing, too, is that if Jesus really was dead and did not rise from the dead, how do you explain the spread of Christianity in the Roman Empire? I mean, somebody would have produced the body. Somebody said, yeah, but every one of the apostles, except for John, who was exiled, all of them went to their death believing they saw Jesus rise from the dead. One of them would break. He's like, you know what? I mean, I know, guys, we had this going on a pretty long time. You know, he's not dead. He's not risen. He's dead. We all, no, none of them said that. They all went to their death claiming they saw him rise from the dead. Yeah. Yes. Well, yes. The artifacts, yes. 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 Yeah, the artifacts are based on some of the early copies that we have, and they're accurate even amongst themselves. So, yes. Yes, in the back.
You were talking about him. Oh, thank you. Can you hear me? Person of Interest?
Yes, J. Warner Wallace.
Yes, I just read that, and it's the impact that Jesus had on all of history, in art, in science, and like he was the explosion, and he looks at it from investigative reporter, homicide detective
Yes.
aspect of it, and he sees the fuse to the explosion, which is Jesus, and then the fallout from that, and
Yes.
it's undeniable. I mean, it's undeniable. And so I would say that people that don't really see all of this or want to see all of this or have been presented with this and then still choose no are willfully ignorant and intellectually dishonest.
Amen. Couldn't agree more. I know Jim, actually, personally. Jim's been in my house a couple of times, and he is a great guy, really great guy. His newest book is called Truth and True Crime. And if anybody's here, the true crime detective, like all these true crime, shows, check out Jim's book because he's actually been involved. He was a real homicide detective. In fact, I heard him stories at my house. He told us a long story about this cold case they worked on in Los Angeles, in Orange County in California, about a nurse who was choked by a wire, and it was like 30-year-old case. No one knew that was. And it was this small detail that was missed as circumstantial evidence that helped them solve the case. It was on Dateline NBC. They had the whole Dateline show on it, and Jim was the lead investigator for this cold case thing. So he wrote a book on cold case Christianity, but his latest book is called Truth and True Crime. So he's using his skills as a forensic murder investigator to solve some of these things. And I mean, you're dealing with homicides. You're dealing with suspects and accomplices. And what detectives do is they'll take them and they'll try to mix up their story. And if you're a cop, when people are lying. You just kind of, you've been around, And as he looks at the Gospels and looks at all the things, these people believed and really firmly knew they saw Jesus risen from the dead. They were not making anything up. So, last comment, question, Rabbi Jeff.
Yeah. If you have time, do you have anything to say about the dream stealing? That's going back to Egypt, but
Yes, the dream stealing. So fascinating, great. I'm glad you brought this up. So the death of the firstborn. Let's go back to the plague of the death of the firstborn, which was an affront to Amenhotep II. His oldest son did not succeed him. How do we know this? We know this because of the dream stealing. The dream stealing was excavated in the 19th century, and it was in between the paws of the Sphinx. So the Sphinx is like this, heads up. In between, there's a huge stele, and the stele actually contains an inscription from Thutmose IV. And essentially what it says, and I'll give you the paraphrase of this, is that I wanted to be Pharaoh, but I was not the oldest of my father, essentially. But my brother died in an unforeseen turn of events. The gods had favor on me, and I became the king of Egypt. So it's called his dream, he dreamed that one day he'd be Pharaoh, and the gods granted his dream, and he became the Pharaoh of Egypt. And this was the second or third oldest son of Amenhotep II, who would have been the Pharaoh of the Exodus. So his oldest son, it doesn't say how he died, but he wasn't around. It was an unforeseen turn of events that happened to his brother. So what that unforeseen turn of events was the death of the firstborn. And that is a great piece of evidence from the Exodus. Thank you so much, Jeff. Rabbi Jeff, do you have any words or prayer, benediction? or anyone else?
Why don't we close with the Aaronic benediction? After being in this air conditioning all day, I don't know if I can chant it, but I can coach over here.
Encouragement.
Yevarechecha Adonai v'yishmorecha Yair Adonai panav alecha v'chunecha Yisa Adonai panav alecha v'yasem lecha shalom. May the Lord bless you and keep you. May the Lord lift up his face make his face to shine upon you and be gracious unto you. May the Lord lift up his face upon you and grant you shalom. In Yeshua's name, amen. And thank you so much, Ted.
Thank you.
We also need, just to close, because he's got to, after talking all day like this, he's then got to drive 2.5 hours to Chicago because he's got a speaking engagement in the morning. So we offered him a hotel for the night, but he was faithful to that speaking engagement. So God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, we bless Ted. We thank you for him, and we ask you to keep him awake and alert, Lord God, for his drive home. And we ask you, Lord God, that you will bless and anoint his speaking engagement tomorrow morning. We pray this, and we pray, Lord God, for the lecture that he's supposed to give in Turkey next month. We pray that you will